All right, so in this one, I want to talk about kind of a notion of free will and choice within the general context of the notion of there being God. And, you know, in my conception of things, everything is oneness, which is a state of pure, unrealized potential. The physical universe springs out of that potential. Got other videos talking about that, so I won't deep dive into that here. And then essentially the next step down from O, oneness, is G, God, and God is the entirety of experience. So God is the experience, the experiencing, the experiencer, the experienced. Basically all aspects of what is, all aspects of creation are God. That means I'm God, this hair is God, every booger I pick out of my nose is God, you're God, the phone's God, every thought you've ever had, every twitch of your eye, right? Well, you got to remember too, not just nouns, but all the verbs are God too, the adverbs are all God. In other words, everything's God. And then, you know, in the cosmology, again, I won't deep dive this too much here, but you've got spirits, which are God, essentially individuating into perspectives to more fully experience and express God's self. And then the spirits do that same move with physical beings. So just as God individuates into spirits, to have a richer and fuller perspective, essentially see oneself through a variety of different aspects. The spirit does the same thing with physical bodies, so, you know, multiple incarnations for that same purpose. And so you and I, in that designation, if oneness was O, God was G, spirit is uppercase I, you and I, physical beings down here, having a very immersive physical experience, we're that lowercase I, and we're essentially an aspect of spirit, which is an aspect of God, which is a manifestation of the oneness. Okay. So how is there choice? How could there be anything like free will? How could we have any kind of discretion to operate within such an environment? Because, and I guess let me back up briefly for a second. So another kind of premise that I kind of sense is true, or at least that I believe, is that everything is perfect, right? And when I say perfect, I don't mean it lives up to our individual subjective standards of what perfection should be. I mean from a position of omnipotence, omniscience, and omni-lovingness, right? Being completely and utterly loving, completely and utterly knowledgeable, completely and utterly powerful, which in that state of oneness, that state of pure potential, that's where that springs from. From that state, things are literally unfolding exactly right as, you could say, planned, designed, desired. In other words, there's no slippage, no gap, no shortcoming, no kind of fudging this or being lazy on that, or hey, God had a hangover this day and so that's why he made, you know, this seem like that. It's that everything is emerging precisely, without exception, down to the pixel, to the smidge, the way that someone or something that knew everything, had power over everything, and loved everything completely would do it. And the only reason it seems otherwise is essentially disbelief that we've kind of stitched into ourselves to allow ourselves to have this experience. Otherwise, we kind of rapture back into that oneness state, which we're all going to go back to eventually. But in that perfection, we're giving ourselves this immersed experience where things seem imperfect, wrong, etc. Okay, so choice. So the notion here is, okay, well, if everything's perfect, everything's being designed from this state of oneness, from the state of all-knowingness and all power and all love, then why do I have choice, and why do I seem to be able to, like, screw things up, right, or mess things up with my choices, right? So I make the wrong choice, or at least, see, and here's where getting a little glib can be tricky. I say wrong choice, right? And I think that word wrong really hinges on from what perspective are you looking at it, and what standard or rubric are you applying. Because if I say wrong in that ultimate sense, right, that sense I've been talking about, then that really doesn't describe anything, because everything's unfolding perfectly, right? And Byron Katie, I'm a teacher I really respect, you know, talks about how this concept of there being a mistake, it really doesn't map onto anything. It doesn't describe anything, right? Because everything's unfolding perfectly. How could there be a mistake? And yet we, in real time, have very, very convincing experiences of there being a mistake, right? I'm driving right now. If I were to rear end this car, right, because I were to look down at the camera, right, and not be paying attention visually there, I would, and I would mean it, I'd be like, oh, I just made a mistake, right? That was an error. And especially if it caused physical harm to someone else or to myself, right? A lot of damage to the cars, costs money, costs time. How could that not be wrong? How could that not be a mistake? And I think there's a couple kind of interesting little tidbits or, viewpoints I'm getting off of this. So one is, notice how I'm gauging what is or isn't a mistake. I'm gauging it on my sense of right and wrong, right? My sense of what's good or bad, my sense of kind of what's acceptable or unacceptable. And what's really tricky about this is, it's easy on the level of like personal preference or personal taste to kind of be able to soften that and let that go. To be like, hey, agree to disagree. Beauty's in the eye of the beholder. You look at a painting, you think it's ugly. I look at a painting, I think it's gorgeous. We can kind of back away and say, hey, these are just our aesthetic tastes. But when it comes down to things like, is a human life lost, right? Does somebody become paralyzed? Does someone lose all of their money? If an action that I take or that you take results in that to someone else, do we have the faith to be able to say, even inwardly to ourselves, that no mistake was made and that everything was perfect? And so what I think this kind of opens up for me is the, kind of the distinction between perfection and learning and why there's an unfolding in time. So for example, if I'm driving and I'm like, looking down at the camera and I'm like, checking my hair while I'm driving, and boom, I rear end somebody, I may learn a lesson, right? That lesson may be, hey bro, when you're driving, watch the good dang road, right? Stop looking over, stop distracting yourself, right? Don't be texting, don't be absorbed in something, pay attention to the road. And what I can say then too is, look, it was perfect that that happened. It was perfect that I learned, and it was perfect that I moved forward. And hopefully I'm then a safer driver in the future and don't pose the same risk. I think a mistake we might make, though, would be to draw a circle around that sequence and to say, okay, well, I'm going to see the perfection as being that, right? In other words, I'm going to justify the original occurrence of the accident by looking at how I, as an individual being, ultimately learned and benefited from it, or how others benefited from it. And I think the mistake there is we're essentially drawing a circle too tightly around a limited series of causes and effects, which kind of speaks to that original point, which is we are so tied to our perspective, so tied to the sense of what we're doing or what happens to us, that we really tend to highlight or emphasize those causes and effects and not realize that all causes and effects are completely interdependent. And there's a way, in physical being and physical reality, we say, well, look, someone's over in China right now, someone's down in Tasmania right now, and maybe they're deciding whether to write their letter with a blue pen or a black pen, right? Or, someone right now is in a, tent in Antarctica, and they're sitting there and they're trying to decide how many packets of sugar to put in their coffee. And are you saying that that affects me? Are you saying that that has an influence on me? And what I think is kind of interesting about that, you kind of get into the butterfly effect and all those things, is yes, on some level, everything on the physical level is the physical universe. Our mind draws these lines around what is me, what is you, right? We see systems of cause and effect, right? Ecosystems. We see a system of a body, right? Organ systems, endocrine systems. And so we see me as a unit with all these kind of subunits and subsystems, right, operating within kind of my local environment. And we may say, hey, if your wife makes those decisions, right, or your child makes those decisions, they may have more of an effect on you than if someone on the other side of the world does it, because they're in your immediate view, they're providing you with immediate sensory information that may then affect decisions you make. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, but it misses the larger point, which is that the way we chunk the universe is something our brain does to essentially make an undifferentiated mass of information digestible for the purposes of basically moving our genes into the next generation. So briefly unpacking that, the primate brain is the product of evolution. The brain's purpose is not to give us an unfiltered, unadorned, an unlimited view of what is actually reality. It's designed to essentially present us kind of a video game that our brain can play to, you know, get food, get mates, get status, get security, get safety. And of course, it's not confined to that, right? We're able to use our brains. If you notice me looking at the camera, I've parked. We're able to use our brains for art, you know, for deep explorations in science, all kinds of things that don't bear on our immediate, you know, our immediate genetic fitness, or at least it doesn't seem so. But the point is, if we think we're kind of sitting here and the eyes are just a window to the universe, to reality, and all we see, right, is just basically all there is coming at us. I think a really obvious counterpoint to that, I don't know if you watched the reboot of Cosmos. Neil deGrasse Tyson hosts it, but he talked about, you know, look, there's X-ray waves out there, gamma ray waves, you know, gravitational waves, all these different things that are out there that if our eyes were trained to see them, we would behold a universe vastly different than what we see right now. What we see is in that narrow band of range of visible light, whatever that is reflecting on into our brain, and whatever our brain is then able to translate into an image. We don't experience the outside world, we experience the brain's recreation of the outside world based on a constant influx of sensory data. And the reason we get fooled by it or we're confused, I think partly is we've evolved a sense of inner self that's designed to work within that generated brain image, but also because the brain does a pretty good job most of the time of keeping a kind of steady image of an environment, a pretty static picture, such that we feel like we're really in it, as opposed to being in a brain that's generating essentially a virtual image of the environment. And again, that virtual image is very much confined based on what that brain has been trained to see, right? And so a fish's brain is going to pull very different information from the environment than a human brain is, than a tiger brain is, than a spider brain is, right? Pick your poison. And we haven't even gotten to the potential of, you know, is there extraterrestrial life out there? What did their brains evolve to see? Do they even have brains? All those things. So this is a video about choices, and I've gone down a couple rabbit holes here, but so essentially the idea is, I think we just don't appreciate in moment to moment the, not confinements, but the limitations or constrictions we're working in. And we think we're working in a state of kind of an absolute engagement. We think this is the world, this is the universe, I'm interacting with it, I got it. And we may be looking at a pinhead's worth of information compared to a globe, right? That globe being the entirety of the environment, and the pinhead being that little bit of data our brain is able to process from the environment. And again, it's going to pick those things that are most important to it. And I think likewise with choice, we're then always working within that framework of the primate, right? The physical being in the physical environment with a finite brain that has limited processing power. And so that brain's going to essentially generate an interactive video game environment. And I'm not saying it's all fake. It's based on, I believe, real information from a physical environment, but it's just that it's taking very, very limited data, but then building in the brain the sense of kind of a whole picture, right? Like when I'm looking out right now, I'm parked in kind of a mini mall area, and I'm looking around and I'm seeing hills in the distance. I'm seeing these building facades in front of me, right? I'm seeing the inside of the car. I'm seeing the screen. I don't feel like I'm missing anything. And I don't feel like there's a ton of data that isn't being provided, right? Because I don't know what I don't know. And even if I do know that, hey, there's a ton of other types of waves, I can't see the radio waves, I can't see the X-rays, I can't see all those things. Very quickly I forget that, because again, I'm working in a primate brain, and the primate brain goes, well, who cares what you can or cannot see? How is that helping our larger purposes of attending to our environment, getting our next meal, right? Maintaining the relationships, right? All those things, right? All the things that we as primates very naturally think of, but that aren't necessarily the things that are most interesting to something in the mind, a curiosity that isn't necessarily bound to the primate experience. And I think that curiosity, which kind of goes beyond the primate exigencies and the primate priorities, and gets to kind of, is able to go into more an abstracted sense of self and an abstracted sense of priorities, where it can kind of lose itself in a puzzle or a problem for a while. That, I think, is getting more into the, if I use lowercase I, uppercase I, G, and O for physical being, spirit, God, and oneness. As you drift into that abstraction, I think you're tapping into kind of the frequency or the bandwidth of some of those higher order ways of being. Because again, we're kind of getting out of the wetware and its concerns and getting into kind of a broader, less bounded, less kind of taskmaster driven way of being. I keep saying this is a video about choice. I do promise I'm going to circle back there. I don't yet see exactly how yet, but it's basically, I guess, this notion that when we're then stuck in our physical paradigm and stuck in kind of the primate paradigm, and we're not appreciating and recognizing that by design, our experience of our physical reality and our usual thoughts about our physical reality are all kind of directed toward these purposes determined by our genes and then reinforced by our cultural conditioning. And so when we talk about whether something is perfect, when we talk about something was a mistake, and we think about, for example, a choice, say an accidental or negligent choice of mine, like I'm driving and I'm looking down at my screen instead of looking at the road, and I hit somebody, right? And let's say that causes them to lose their leg, right? And it almost feels cruel or inhumane or numb or callous to say that was perfect, right? That unfolded in perfection perfectly. And I think the reason, though, is our minds so instinctively think to cause and effect. We think to consequence. We have empathy, and so I think, oh my God, that person's leg is now gone. What if my leg was gone or a loved one's leg was gone? How terrible would that be, right? We think by analogy, or I just can even look at them and see the pain they're in and feel an empathy or a pain within myself. And then there's kind of this thought of like, how could this be perfect? How could their suffering be perfect? The pain I am now by proxy feeling, right? How could this be perfect? Just notice, though, over and over, and I think this kind of gets into the first and second noble truths of the Buddha. It's all circling back to this small, kind of confined sense of self, and we have to use these concepts of right, wrong, good or bad to try to simplify what can be an overwhelming wash of data, or really a web of complexity and interconnectedness that's so hard for our brains to keep track of, where we could say simultaneously, I am so sorry that I hit you and I caused your leg to go off, and I can feel genuine contrition. I can try to make amends in this life. And I may carry a guilt or a shame about it to my grave, and then to have a certain remove from that, to be able to go up in that perspective of spirit or God or oneness, and to recognize that it's actually kind of arrogant or presumptuous for us to say that just because that bothered me, that on some objective level that was wrong, just because that was a suffering or something that would cause us horror to think of that happening to ourselves or a loved one, that from an objective level that means it's wrong. And this, I think, is that odd intersection, and it almost is kind of hard to talk about, is that difference between the emotional resonance of a situation, which we can all share, right? 100 out of 100 people may look at that and go, that was a tragedy, you were at fault, that was wrong, you should feel bad, right? And then looking out and saying, and any God that created this is terrible or cruel or awful, not appreciating the limited set of worries and conditionings that are creating our consensus on that being a bad thing. You could imagine, for example, an alien kind of coming in and hovering, and the alien has the notion that everything that unfolds is perfect. There is no tragedy, there is no comedy, there is nothing that's bad. I can recognize those as patterns of unfolding, but I don't associate them with things being right or wrong, good or bad, right? I just see that as another pattern that's unfolding. And so that alien's hovering above and watches that car accident, right? And I'll take myself out of this. Watches person A hit person B causing person B's leg to be removed. And that alien, though, because it's not caught up in our interpersonal dramas, doesn't have our conditioning, right? Our cultural conditioning, our genetic conditioning to see certain things as right and wrong. It just sees the unfolding of that and doesn't have an emotional reaction, doesn't draw lines around it, doesn't put it into buckets of good or bad, right or wrong. And so, what is this, the fifth or the sixth time I've said I'm going to get back to choice? I think this then comes back to this notion of, well, how can things be perfect if we're left with choice and we watch ourselves and others so clearly screw things up all the time, use choice, use discretion over and over in a way that seems wrong to us? And I think the notion is, first of all, it's just not wrong, because how could it be? If God is creating everything, right, and is everything, and knows everything, right, and has power and control over everything, right, and is completely loving, then how could anything that's occurring be wrong, right? See how that's kind of that presumptuousness we have, where we, from our perspective, think our viewpoints and our notions of right and wrong are so correct, and again, they get reinforced by the consensus we have on this, that we then would presume that God must be making a mistake, or God must be sadistic or cruel or torturous, instead of saying, maybe I'm actually operating in a primate brain that is very, very intensely coiled around certain notions, and that as I uncoil those notions or get into a perspective that isn't as bound by them, the perfection of things can actually seem more obvious, the way it might be, say, to that visiting alien. And so the idea is, when I feel like I have a choice, my conception of that is essentially, again, I'm God, and I'm also this physical being that isn't omniscient, isn't omnipotent, right, isn't omni-loving, or at least doesn't seem to be having that experience, right? I don't know what the lottery numbers are going to be, otherwise I would pick them and win, right? And so I'm in this experience, and then I'm having this choice, right? Do I turn my blinker on when I change the lane, or do I not? Right? Do I end the video now, or do I keep it going? And kind of the upshot of this message, 22 minutes into this video, is if I, as God, have given my finite, limited self discretion, that then is perfect. Meaning I can't screw it up, right? I can, on the immediate level, do something that I would say is a screw up, that a jury may say is a screw up, that if you do it on, go by the Family Feud rules, pull 100 random people at a shopping mall, what do they say? They're going to all say that's a screw up. But notice that's still just consensus, either inner consensus, interpersonal consensus, kind of statistical group consensus. Go back to the other perspective, right? We are all God. You are God. I am God. We are also then this physical being, this lowercase I, which God has then kind of configured with ignorance and disbelief and limitations and confined perspective. And sorry, I just had a little hitch there. I'm realizing I'm on an errand, so let me try and tidy this up here. Essentially, if we have discretion to make a choice, it's discretion that from our position of omnipotence, omni-lovingness, and omniscience, right, all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-loving, that we essentially gave to ourselves. And that part of the reason we may have done it is so that we in life can have this experience of making a choice, learning, and coming to make, on the local level, better choices to try to perhaps reduce our suffering or the suffering of others, things like that. It's perfection all the way through, but we get the experience of evolving, of progressing, of learning. And so, kind of coming back to the core premise, let me see if I could tie a bow on it, or at least bring it to a conclusion that feels somewhat coherent. Choice is not unlimited, right? I can't choose to point my finger, well, I could choose to point my finger at that lamp, which is now off, and say turn on, right? But that's not a choice that's been given to me in the flow of perfection, right? But the choice to, spin this wheel around, to put up 1 finger, 3 fingers, 2 fingers, right? Make the 0. These are choices. And so I guess what I'm saying is work backwards from discretion or choice, and see that if it's discretion or choice that's been given to you from a divine perspective, it is perfect. It cannot be messed up. There's no route or timeline or chain of events that could flow from any choice you make that is anything other than perfect. And from our lowercase I perspective, our human perspective, our perspective of meat and bone and blood and matter and a lifespan and liability and people getting hurt and crying and us feeling the pain of that and knowing that that pain is real and their suffering is real, consequences stemming from choices, right? Things can very much seem the other way. And so what is a healthy life? What is a healthy attitude toward choice? I think it's one that can maintain a superposition of those two perspectives. One that can recognize on the ultimate level, we never make mistakes. We never do anything wrong. We are God. And even though we've confined ourselves in certain configurations of ignorance and disbelief, we are still always in the flow of creation, always operating perfectly. And as long as we're in this primate body, right, even I think if you achieve something like the Buddha achieved or the Bodhisattvas achieve or the people with extreme peace and serenity achieve, it's really hard, at least for me, to imagine that if we make a choice that results in harm to another person, that we're not on some level going to feel contrition about that, right? Or feel like that was a mistake or an error. And so I think that that second part of the perspective, right? In the first part, we recognize everything is perfect and can be no other way. But in the second one, we get opportunities to feel and experience genuine contrition and to be able to express that contrition to others to make amends. And we get to learn from our mistakes, right? Acknowledge our mistakes, learn from our mistakes, so that going forward, we hopefully cause less intentional or unintentional harm to ourselves or others, and reduce the amount of suffering that's in the world. And what does it take to maintain that superposition of essentially perspective on whether something's a mistake or not? I think it just takes a certain discipline of the mind, a certain faith in that first outlook. The second outlook is obviously very easy to maintain because it's emotionally kind of cooked into us. But that first outlook of everything being perfection really sometimes requires a deep faith or an ability to not identify so intensely with our thoughts and feelings and with our sense of what a consensus perspective is on right and wrong, either within the individual or among the collective. Okay, I'm going to tie it up there.